History often paints Rome as invincible, an empire destined to rise above all others. But there was a time when that illusion nearly cracked apart. It wasn't Julius Caesar or Augustus who brought Rome to the brink of collapse. It was a man from Carthage, Hannibal Barca, whose name carried the weight of fear, respect, and ruthless ambition. To the Romans was a ghost in the dark, a genius with a mind sharper than any sword. To his soldiers, he was a daring leader who embraced impossible odds. Hannibal's Gambit during the Second Punic War wasn't just bold, it was audacious enough to make the entire Roman Republic tremble. Carthage, Rome's greatest rival, had already clashed with the empire once before in the First Punic War. That conflict ended with Carthage humiliated, losing its dominance at sea and paying heavy reparations. But Hannibal had grown up in that shadow of defeat, raised by a father, Hannibal Barca, who hated Rome with every breath. Hannibal swore an oath as a boy, promising never to be Rome's friend. That promise wasn't just personal, it became his destiny. When the Second Punic War erupted, Hannibal didn't simply answer Rome's challenge. He carried the vengeance of an entire nation on his shoulders, determined to make Rome bleed. From the start, Hannibal's plan was pure audacity. Most generals would fight on familiar ground, close to supply lines and safe strongholds. Hannibal chose the opposite. He would take his army, elephants included, from Spain, across treacherous rivers, through hostile tribes, and over the deadly Alps, into Italy itself. It sounded insane, a suicide mission, but Hannibal believed surprise was his deadliest weapon. Rome would never expect a foreign army to storm its heartland, and that shock alone could unravel their alliances. It was genius wrapped in madness, a gamble few leaders in history would have dared to attempt. The march to Italy became legend. Even among enemies, Hannibal's forces faced blistering cold, avalanches, and constant harassment by mountain tribes. Soldiers slipped from cliffs, or starved as supplies dwindled. The elephants, majestic symbols of power, stumbled through the snow, terrifying locals who had never seen such beasts. Yet somehow, against impossible odds, Hannibal led survivors through. He lost nearly half his army, but the men who made it were hardened, loyal, and ready to fight. By the time they descended into the fertile plains of Italy, Hannibal's ragged army looked less like victims and more like predators unleashed. When Hannibal entered Italy, panic rippled across the Republic. The Senate hadn't imagined Carthage's wall would come to their doorstep so soon. Farmers abandoned fields, citizens whispered of invasion, and Rome scrambled to muster legions. The Republic had always prided itself on discipline and unity, but Hannibal threatened to unravel both. The Senate believed sheer numbers would crush him quickly. What they didn't yet understand was that Hannibal wasn't just another general. He was a master of turning Roman strengths into vulnerabilities. The war was no longer distant. Rome itself was now the battlefield, and Hannibal was in control. The Battle of Trebia marked Hannibal's opening strike, facing a larger Roman army. He exploited weather, terrain, and arrogance. His cavalry lured Roman troops into freezing rivers, exhausting them before the real fight began. Hidden units ambushed from the flanks, collapsing the Roman formation. Soldiers who had trusted in discipline drowned or were cut down. Rome lost thousands, and survivors limped home, humiliated. Hannibal had announced his presence with devastating clarity. This wasn't luck. This was genius. Rome realized that the man they faced wasn't reckless, he was calculating, ruthless, and ready to dismantle their confidence, one battle at a time. If Trebia shocked Rome, the Battle of Lake Trasimene terrified them. Hannibal orchestrated one of the largest ambushes in history. He positioned his army in the hills, overlooking the narrow path by the lake. As fog rolled in, Roman troops marched blindly into a trap. Hannibal's men attacked from all sides, cutting off escape. Horses crashed, shields splintered, and screams echoed in the mist. Thousands of Romans perished in confusion, many never drawing a sword. Word of the massacre spread like wildfire. For the first time in generations, Rome wasn't just defeated, it was humiliated. Panic gripped the Republic's heart, but Hannibal's victories weren't only military triumphs, they were psychological warfare. Each success chipped away at Rome's aura of invincibility. Allies who once obeyed the Republic now hesitated, whispering that Carthage might be the stronger power. Cities under Roman influence began reconsidering their loyalty. Hannibal understood that wars weren't won solely with swords. They were won by breaking faith, by turning Rome's friends into doubters and its allies into rebels. His battlefield brilliance echoed into politics. Every Roman defeat echoed louder than any speech, eroding confidence in a republic that once seemed untouchable. Hannibal was winning on every front. Rome's response was predictable. Throw more men into the fire. The Senate believed that overwhelming numbers would eventually crush Hannibal. Yet Hannibal knew Rome's pride was its weakness. He counted on them, rushing into battle, confident that size meant victory. He would show them how wrong they were. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define his legacy and haunt Roman memory forever. At Cannae, Hannibal would craft a masterpiece of warfare. Trebia and Trasimene had rattled Rome. Cannae would come close to destroying it completely. Hannibal wasn't just playing the game, he was rewriting it. By the summer of 216 BCE, both armies assembled on the plains of Cannae. Rome fielded one of the largest forces in its history, nearly 80,000 strong. They believed brute force would settle the war. Hannibal, outnumbered, seemed doomed, but appearances were deceiving. He arranged his army in a crescent, deliberately placing weaker troops in the center. As the Romans surged forward, his line bent but did not break. The Romans pressed harder, pushing deeper, unaware they were sealing their fate. Hannibal's cavalry swept behind, encircling them completely. What followed was a slaughter so brutal that it seared itself into Roman memory. The slaughter at Cannae stunned the ancient world. In a single day, Hannibal destroyed a Roman army that dwarfed his own. Tens of thousands of legionaries were killed or captured, their bodies left scattered across the dusty plain. Rome, the empire that prided itself on discipline and order, had been humiliated in front of all Italy. Survivors whispered of an unstoppable genius, a man who turned defeat into art. Hannibal had achieved the impossible. He had made Rome bleed in ways it had never bled before. The world now held its breath, wondering if Rome's end was near. In the aftermath, Rome was paralyzed with fear. Cities across Italy hesitated, questioning whether to remain loyal or side with Hannibal. Some had defected, joining his cause, while others waited to see who would truly control the future. The Senate faced panic, and rumors swirled of abandoning the city itself. But Rome was stubborn. Instead of surrender, they doubled down. They appointed Fabius Maximus, the Cunctator, or delayer, who crafted a strategy not of confrontation, but of survival. Rome would no longer rush into Hannibal's traps. They would avoid battle, stretch the war, and wear him down slowly, like water eroding stone. Hannibal's gamble at Cannae brought glory, but not final victory. Despite his brilliance, Rome refused to collapse. The city was built on discipline, resilience, and a refusal to admit defeat. Even after losing entire armies, they raised new ones. Even after humiliating losses, their Senate refused to negotiate peace. Hannibal had thought Rome's allies would desert en masse, but loyalty proved stubborn. Some cities defected, but many clung to Rome, fearing Carthage's dominance just as much as they feared Roman wrath. The war shifted. Hannibal had struck his hardest blow, but Rome was learning, adapting, and preparing for the long game. For years, Hannibal roamed the Italian countryside. His armies burned fields, ambushed patrols, and camped near Roman strongholds, daring them to fight. Yet Rome refused. Under Fabius' cautious strategy, the legions shadowed Hannibal, cutting off his supplies, avoiding battle, and letting time do the work. Hannibal raged at the missed opportunities, but he could not force Rome's hand. His victories became less frequent. His momentum slowed. The genius who had nearly toppled the Republic now faced an enemy that simply refused to die. Rome's resilience became as terrifying as Hannibal's brilliance. A duel of endurance. Neither side could easily win. Hannibal's situation grew complicated. His army, though loyal, was far from home. Supplies dwindled, and reinforcements from Carthage were scarce. The Senate in Carthage, divided and cautious, hesitated to give Hannibal the full support he needed. They saw his victories as impressive, but they didn't share his urgency. Without reinforcements, Hannibal's gamble grew riskier by the year. He was winning battles but losing time. And in war, time is often the deadliest enemy. Rome's patience began to pay off, while Hannibal's brilliance slowly dulled under the weight of exhaustion and missed opportunities. Yet even in this difficult stage, Hannibal remained dangerous. His mere presence in Italy forced Rome to commit vast resources to defense. Farmers lived in fear, cities trembled at rumors of his march, and Roman soldiers carried the trauma of past defeats. Hannibal became a shadow over the Republic, a reminder that safety was never guaranteed. He couldn't topple Rome with one strike anymore, but he could bleed them slowly, forcing them into a war of attrition. His genius had carried him to Italy, but now his survival depended on endurance, cunning, and a hope that Carthage would finally send aid. Meanwhile, Rome adapted its strategy beyond Italy. Instead of chasing Hannibal endlessly, they shifted focus to Spain and North Africa, targeting Carthage's resources and allies. Tease was Rome brilliance when the enemy couldn't be beaten head-on. They looked for other pressure points. Hannibal was still feared in Italy, but Carthage's lifelines were being cut elsewhere. Rome began winning victories abroad, weakening Hannibal's base. He remained undefeated in Italy, yet the walls around him were tightening. The Republic's strength lay not in one general, but in its ability to outlast and outmaneuver even the greatest of opponents. The years dragged on, and Hannibal's gamble began to fade. His army was still respected, his name still feared, but the dream of breaking Rome's will slipped further away. Allies who had joined him began drifting back to Rome's side, realizing the Carthaginian commander could not guarantee ultimate victory. Rome's endless supply of manpower, their stubborn will to fight, and their growing success abroad turned the tide. Hannibal was still in Italy, but he was no longer winning the war. The brilliance of his early campaigns was now overshadowed by the weight of reality. Yet, through all this, Hannibal's legend only grew. Even as Rome adapted, even as his situation worsened, he remained undefeated in pitched battles. No Roman commander could claim a decisive victory against him in Italy. His name became synonymous with terror, whispered by parents to frighten children into obedience. He was not just a general. He was a myth symbol of what Rome most feared, and though his chance to destroy Rome slipped away, his shadow remained. Hannibal's gamble had failed to topple the Republic, but it had carved his name permanently into history's memory. By the time Rome finally regained its confidence, Hannibal had already spent over a decade in Italy. His army, once full of energy and ferocity, was tired and dwindling. Carthage's failure to send reinforcements sealed his fate. Rome, now stronger, more experienced, and more united than ever, prepared for its counter. They would take the war back to Carthage itself, forcing Hannibal to defend his homeland. The hunter who had stalked Rome across its own fields would now be dragged back across the sea. The greatest gamble in ancient warfare was nearing its endgame. As Rome shifted the war's momentum, Hannibal found himself trapped in a slow spiral. His genius on the battlefield had carried him across the Alps and into Rome's heartland. But strategy alone could not sustain a war that stretched for decades. Supplies ran thinner, allies dwindled, and Carthage remained frustratingly cautious. Rome, once panicked, now played the long game, grinding Hannibal down with patience and overwhelming resources. The man who once seemed unstoppable was being cornered by time itself. Yet even in these dire circumstances, Hannibal never lost his sharpness, adapting, maneuvering, and keeping Rome fearful with every move. The Senate in Carthage grew more skeptical with each passing year, while Hannibal begged for reinforcements. They hesitated, fearing the costs and distrusting his gamble. Some envied his glory, others doubted his chances, and many were simply paralyzed by politics. Without their support, Hannibal's army became increasingly isolated. He could still fight, still terrify Rome, but he could no longer hope to end the war without help. Carthage's indecision would become one of the great tragedies of the Second Punic War. They had a general who could win battles, but they failed to give him the means to win the war. Rome, meanwhile, turned its eyes abroad. In Spain, Roman generals like Scipio the Elder and later his son, Scipio Africanus, began to strike at Carthage's strongholds. These victories cut Hannibal's supply lines, weakening his position in Italy. By attacking where Hannibal was not, Rome proved its flexibility. It was no longer about defeating Hannibal in open battle, it was about strangling him strategically. Every Carthaginian defeat abroad was a nail in the coffin of Hannibal's campaign. His genius was unmatched, but he could not fight everywhere at once. Slowly, the walls of Rome's resilience closed in around him. Despite setbacks, Hannibal remained undefeated in Italy. For over a decade, no Roman commander could claim victory against him in direct battle. This longevity only added to his legend. Farmers still feared his approach. Roman soldiers still carried the trauma of Cannae, and even senators whispered his name with unease. Hannibal had become more than a man, he was a force of nature, a walking reminder that Rome was vulnerable. Yet his victories, no matter how brilliant, were hollow without decisive results. He could frighten Rome, but he could not crush it. The Emperor's willpower proved stronger than fear. Scipio Africanus emerged as Rome's answer to Hannibal, charismatic, ambitious, and a student of Hannibal's tactics. Scipio had grown up during the darkest days of the war. He understood that defeating Hannibal required more than numbers, it required outsmarting him. In Spain, Scipio delivered victories that secured resources for Rome and stripped Carthage of critical allies. His boldness mirrored Hannibal's own, and soon he became the Senate's best hope. Where older generals had failed with caution or arrogance, Scipio offered a new approach. Learn from the enemy and then turn his methods against him. Rome had finally found its counter. As Scipio rose, Hannibal's influence waned. His army, once filled with hardened veterans, had shrunk to a shadow of its former self. Supplies remained scarce, morale grew thin, and the dream of conquering Rome slipped further away. Carthage's refusal to fully support him left Hannibal stranded in hostile territory. Yet even weakened, he was still dangerous. Every Roman commander knew that underestimating him could mean disaster. Hannibal was no longer a conqueror but a survivor, dragging out a campaign against impossible odds. His gamble had not failed outright, but it was slipping from his grasp. One brutal year at a time, Rome's decision to bring the war to North Africa was bold and risky. Scipio proposed invading Carthage itself, forcing Hannibal to abandon Italy. At first, the Senate hesitated, fearful of leaving Hannibal unchecked, but Scipio argued that the best way to beat him was to strike at his homeland, to make Carthage call him back. The Senate finally agreed. Roman legions prepared to cross the sea, shifting the battleground entirely. Hannibal, who had spent over 15 years haunting Italy, would now face the impossible choice: remain in Italy or return home to defend Carthage itself. Carthage, alarmed by Rome's advance, finally called Hannibal back. After decades of fighting abroad, he was ordered to return to Africa and confront Scipio. It was a cruel twist. The man who had nearly toppled Rome was now summoned to protect a city that had never fully supported him. Hannibal obeyed, gathering his veterans and preparing for one last confrontation. He knew this would be the defining battle, the endgame of his gamble. Scipio waited in Africa, eager to meet the legend. The stage was set for one of antiquity's greatest showdowns. The Battle of Zama. The march back to Africa weighed heavily on Hannibal. His soldiers, loyal but weary, faced an uncertain future. For years they had fought in Italy, far from home, carrying their commander's dream. Now, they would defend the city that had neglected them, under leaders who had doubted their efforts. Hannibal carried that burden too. He was still brilliant, still cunning, but he knew the odds were no longer in his favor. Scipio had studied him, Rome had grown stronger, and Carthage's hesitation had cost him the initiative. Still, Hannibal prepared, unwilling to surrender without a fight. At Zama, the two greatest minds of the war finally faced each other. Hannibal brought his elephants, his veterans, and his experience. Scipio brought fresh legions, Numidian cavalry allies, and the lessons he had learned from Hannibal himself. The battle would decide not just the war but the fate of the Mediterranean. For Hannibal, it was the final gamble of a lifetime defined by risk. For Scipio, it was a chance to secure eternal glory. As the two armies prepared, the world held its breath. Rome's survival, Carthage's future, and Hannibal's legacy hung in the balance. The Battle of Zama opened with sunder. Hannibal unleashed his war elephants, massive beasts meant to trample the Roman lines and break their formation. But Scipio had prepared for this. He ordered his men to create lanes in their ranks, guiding the elephants harmlessly through before attacking them from the sides. The terrifying spectacle that once shook armies now faltered against discipline and preparation. Hannibal's strongest psychological weapon had lost its edge, and with it, his confidence took a blow. The fight had barely begun, but already the balance shifted in Rome's favor. Hannibal's veterans, hardened by decades of war, fought with unmatched determination. These men had marched with him across the Alps, survived Italy's winters, and bled in countless battles. Against Scipio's fresh legions, their experience gave them an edge. For a time, they pushed the Romans back, proving they were still among the finest warriors in the world. But Scipio's army was not just strong, it was adaptable. With cavalry allies circling and fresh reserves waiting, Rome absorbed the pressure and slowly began to press forward. Hannibal's veterans fought like lions, but even lions tire when the hunt drags on too long. The Numidian cavalry, once allies of Carthage, now sealed Hannibal's fate. Scipio had secured their loyalty, and their horsemen swept across the battlefield, striking Hannibal's flanks. What once was Carthage's strength now became Rome's hammer. Surrounded and pressed from all sides, Hannibal's army began to fracture. His brilliance kept the fight alive longer than expected, but even genius has limits when resources fail. The battlefield that Hannibal once controlled now belonged to Scipio. For the first time in his career, Hannibal tasted undeniable defeat, and with that defeat, Carthage's future darkened. As dust settled over Zema, the war was decided. Hannibal retreated, not in disgrace, but in grim acceptance. His gamble had failed not through lack of brilliance, but because Carthage never matched his vision. The Senate's hesitation, the lack of reinforcements, and Rome's relentless resilience had turned the tide. For Carthage, the terms of surrender were brutal. They lost their fleet, their territories, and their independence in all but name. Rome had won not just the war, but the future of the Mediterranean. Hannibal, once the nightmare of Rome, was now a defeated man carrying the weight of what might have been. Back in Carthage, Hannibal still held influence. His reputation remained unmatched, and the people revered him as the city's greatest defender. He became a statesman, reforming the government, cutting corruption, and trying to restore Carthage's strength. But Rome never forgot. They feared him even in defeat, knowing that his mind remained sharp. Every reform he made, every success he achieved, felt like a threat. Hannibal's new battlefield was politics, but even there, Rome's shadow loomed large. The Republic demanded obedience, and Hannibal's very existence challenged that demand. His war wasn't over, it had simply changed shape. Rome eventually demanded that Hannibal be handed over. They could not tolerate his brilliance. Even as a politician, Carthage, weary and broken, had little choice but to comply. Once again, Hannibal faced exile, fleeing across the Mediterranean to seek refuge among Rome's enemies. Kings welcomed him, eager to learn from his genius, hoping to use him against Rome. Hannibal became a wandering strategist, a teacher of war, who carried with him the scars of past battles. Though defeated, he remained a figure of awe. Wherever he went, whispers followed. This is the man who almost destroyed Rome, even in exile. Hannibal's mind never stopped. He advised foreign kings, crafting strategies to resist Rome's expansion. Yet despite his brilliance, none of his new patrons matched his ambition. They admired him, but few acted with the daring he once commanded. Hannibal had gambled with history itself in Italy, and no one else was willing to risk so much. Slowly, his influence faded, overshadowed by Rome's growing dominance. He had become a symbol of resistance, a reminder that Rome could bleed, but a reminder that the empire could not be broken easily. Hannibal was still feared, but no longer decisive. Hannibal's final years were spent on the run. Rome's hatred pursued him relentlessly, demanding his surrender, even from foreign courts. He had once stood at the gates of Rome, his shadow falling over the Republic itself. Now he was hunted like a criminal, chased from one refuge to another. Yet even in this fall, his dignity remained. Hannibal carried himself with the same calm, the same sharpness, refusing to let Rome claim his life. His story, like his battles, would not end with surrender. It would end on his terms, in a way only he could choose. Surrounded and with no escape left, Hannibal chose death overcaptured, tucking poison. He left behind a final statement. Rome could take his body, but never his spirit. It was a defiance that echoed his entire life. A final act of resistance against the empire that had feared him for decades. His death marked the end of an era, but not the end of his legend. Hannibal remained immortal in memory. The man who crossed the Alps, destroyed Roman armies, and nearly brought down an empire. His body fell, but his story lived on. Hannibal's legacy outlived him by centuries. Generals from Napoleon to modern strategists studied his campaigns, marveling at his tactics at Cannae and beyond. Rome itself, though victorious, never forgot the terror he inspired. Parents warned children with his name. Historians recorded his brilliance, and soldiers remembered his cruelty. Hannibal was not just Carthage's champion, he was history's reminder that even the greatest powers can be shaken by daring genius. His gamble had failed, but it left a mark deeper than victory ever could. Hannibal Barca, the man who almost broke Rome, became timeless. Rome emerged from the Second Punic War stronger than ever, but the scars ran deep. Entire generations of Roman families had been lost, and the fear of Hannibal left a psychological wound that no victory could fully erase. For decades, senators and generals would measure threats against the memory of that Carthaginian. The Republic vowed never again to be caught unprepared. Every reform, every military campaign after Hannibal was shaped by the trauma of those years. Rome had survived, but survival had turned into obsession. Hannibal's ghost haunted their policies long after his death. The Carthaginians, meanwhile, suffered under Rome's terms of peace. Their fleet was gone, their territory stripped, and their economy drained by war reparations. The proud city that once dominated the seas was reduced to a client state, forced to beg for Rome's permission in matters of trade and defense. Carthage still stood, but it stood in chains. For Hannibal's people, the dream of empire had ended. What remained was survival under the watchful eyes of their conquerors. The contrast was bitter. Rome expanded while Carthage withered, punished not just for losing but for daring to challenge Rome at all. Rome's paranoia about Carthage never faded. Even when Carthage rebuilt parts of its economy through trade and agriculture, Rome viewed every success with suspicion. Senators argued that as long as Carthage existed, it could rise again. The phrase "Carthage must be destroyed" echoed in the Senate, a chilling mantra that revealed just how deeply Hannibal had scarred the Roman psyche. Rome's hatred became generational, passed down as if Hannibal himself still lived. Carthage had lost the war, but its greatest general had ensured it remained forever in Rome's shadow of fear. Hannibal's military genius continued to inspire beyond his lifetime. Commanders studied his double envelopment at Cannae as the perfect battle maneuver. For centuries, generals would try to replicate his brilliance. From Frederick the Great to Napoleon Bonaparte, even modern military academies still dissect his campaigns, treating them as timeless lessons in strategy. Hannibal may have lost the war, but in the classroom of history, he remained undefeated. His name became shorthand for audacity, daring, and the fine line between genius and recklessness. Rome had defeated him on the battlefield, but they could never erase his mind from history. The Second Punic War also reshaped Rome itself. The Republic had survived its greatest crisis, but the cost of constant mobilization and sacrifice left cracks in its political system. Ambitious generals rose, using fear of Hannibal to justify greater power. The Senate, while victorious, grew more divided. Rome's resilience was legendary, but resilience bred arrogance. They began to see themselves not just as survivors, but as destined rulers of the Mediterranean. Hannibal's challenge had hardened Rome's resolve, but it also fed their hunger. In defeating Carthage, Rome had created a new identity, an empire in all but name. For elderly Romans, Hannibal's name lingered in stories told by firelight. Parents warned children that if they misbehaved, Hannibal is at the gates. Veterans carried tales of frozen rivers, ambushes in fog, and the horror of Cannae. These memories became part of Rome's cultural fabric, shaping how the Republic saw itself. Hannibal was not just history, he was folklore, a mythic villain who represented the dangers of overconfidence. For centuries, the phrase "Hannibal at the gates" would survive as a metaphor for looming danger. The man who almost destroyed Rome became immortal in their imagination. Carthage's decline did not erase its achievements. The city remained a hub of trade, culture, and learning. Even under Rome's restrictions, its merchants adapted, finding ways to profit within Rome's system. Its artisans and thinkers continued to produce works admired across the Mediterranean. Yet the shadow of defeat loomed over every success. Carthage could build wealth, but not armies. It could plant crops, but not ambitions. The spirit of Hannibal lingered in every citizen's pride, but their hands were bound by treaties. Carthage was alive, but its freedom had been buried with its war elephants. Rome's expansion after Hannibal seemed unstoppable. Freed from the constant fear of invasion, they turned their gaze outward. Greece, Macedonia, and eventually the entire Mediterranean basin fell into Roman hands. Each conquest carried echoes of Hannibal. Rome would not tolerate hesitation, weakness, or threats. The republic that Hannibal nearly broke became an empire fueled by paranoia and ambition. In some ways, Hannibal was Rome's greatest teacher. He taught them fear, endurance, and the cost of arrogance. But Rome twisted those lessons into justification for domination. They conquered the world because they swore never again to face another Hannibal. Hannibal himself became a symbol not just of Carthage, but of defiance against impossible odds. Generals admired him, storytellers praised him, and even his enemies respected him. His name crossed cultures, remembered by both those who cursed him and those who revered him. Rome had the last word militarily, but Hannibal had the last word in legend. His march across the Alps, his brilliance at Cannae, his refusal to bow. These moments survived centuries. Hannibal proved that even in defeat, a man could carve a place in history deeper than those who conquered him. The story of Hannibal's gamble is not only about Rome or Carthage, it is about ambition, risk, and the fine line between triumph and disaster. He dared to attempt what no one else would: bring in an empire to its knees. Tug Illust exposed Rome's vulnerabilities, forced them to adapt, and shapes the destiny of the ancient world. Hannibal's gambit failed, but its echoes still resonate. His life reminds us that sometimes the boldest moves do not end in victory, but in legacy. And sometimes, legacy is the greatest victory of all. The shadow of Hannibal continued to loom long after his death. Roman generals whispered his name when they planned campaigns, measuring themselves against his legend. To them, he was the standard of military genius, the one who had pushed Rome to the brink. Some feared him even in memory, while others studied him like scripture, desperate to understand how one man had nearly toppled their mighty republic. His ghost became a silent advisor in every Senate meeting, a reminder that Rome could never allow complacency. Hannibal had lost, but he dictated Rome's future long after. Rome's relationship with Carthage after the war became a story of dominance and paranoia. Though Carthage posed no military threat, Rome's statesmen could not let go of their fear. Every trade deal, every sign of prosperity, was seen as suspicious. The phrase, "Carthago delenda jest Carthage," must be destroyed, echoed like a drumbeat in Roman politics. Hannibal had planted that paranoia deep, and even after generations passed, it remained alive. Rome had destroyed his armies, but his memory forced them into endless vigilance, shaping their foreign policy with an iron fist. The cultural memory of Hannibal in Rome was complex. He was a villain in Roman stories, but also admired as a figure of brilliance. Children grew up with tales of his cruelty, yet generals grew up with lessons from his genius. Romans hated him, but they also respected him, sometimes more than their own commanders. Hannibal was proof that even Rome could be challenged. That arrogance was dangerous. His dual identity in Roman memory monster and mastermind made him unforgettable. He was their greatest enemy, but also their most valuable teacher. Meanwhile, Carthage itself tried to rebuild the life under Roman oversight. Merchants filled markets, farmers cultivated fertile lands, and citizens carved out a modest prosperity. But the pride of empire was gone. Carthage had been reduced to survival, stripped of ambition. Still, Hannibal's story lingered in every household. Parents told their children of the man who had marched across mountains, who had made Rome tremble. For them, he was not just a general, he was a hero, a symbol of resistance. In defeat Hannibal gave Carthage something Rome could never erase: dignity. Rome's military academies became obsessed with Hannibal's tactics. The double envelopment at Cannae was dissected for centuries, treated as the ultimate blueprint of battlefield perfection. even though Rome suffered devastating losses. They absorbed those lessons, turning Hannibal's genius into their own advantage. Future Roman generals used what they learned from him to conquer new lands. Ironically, the man who nearly destroyed Rome became one of the architects of its imperial expansion. By teaching Rome how to adapt, Hannibal indirectly built the foundations of the empire that would dominate the known world. Generals far beyond Rome also looked to Hannibal. His audacity inspired leaders across history, from medieval commanders to modern strategists. Crossing the Alps with elephants became a symbol of impossible ambition. Winning at Cannae became the gold standard of battlefield dominance. Napoleon studied him. Frederick the Great praised him. Even in modern times, military academies reference him. Hannibal had outlived Carthage, outlived his war, and even outlived Rome. His name transcended his era, proving that legacy can last longer than victory. But for Carthage, legacy wasn't enough. The city remained under Rome's boot, and its people lived with quiet bitterness. They remembered Hannibal not only as a hero, but as a what-if. What if Carthage had supported him fully? What if reinforcements had arrived in time? What if the Senate had shared his vision? These questions lingered like ghosts in every marketplace and forum. Hannibal had given them hope, but Carthage's failure to stand behind him sealed their fate. The tragedy wasn't only his, it was theirs. A nation that wasted its greatest chance, the Second Punic War, had reshaped the Mediterranean forever. Before Hannibal, Carthage and Rome were rivals. After Hannibal, Rome was master. The Republic no longer saw itself as one power among many, but as the inevitable ruler of the world. Hannibal's challenge had hardened Rome into something new. They had faced their greatest fear and survived. From then on, Rome's expansion felt unstoppable. Every new conquest carried Hannibal's shadow, as if Rome was proving to the world and to themselves that they had conquered not just Carthage, but fear itself. For ordinary Romans, the memory of Hannibal faded into legend, but it never vanished. Veterans told grandchildren about the terror of elephants charging, the fog at Trasimene, the massacre at Cannae. Those stories became part of Rome's identity. Rome was strong not just because of victories, but because it had endured Hannibal. Surviving him became a badge of honor, proof of Roman toughness. The man who had brought them so much pain was transformed into a symbol of Roman pride. They hated him, but they needed him to explain who they were. Hannibal's gamble, in the end, was a story of both brilliance and tragedy. He risked everything on a daring strike into the heart of Rome. And for a time, it worked. He showed the world that audacity could shake empires, yet his genius could not overcome weak support, endless Roman resilience, and the slow erosion of time. Hannibal lost, but he never truly failed. His story proves that history remembers more than victorious. It remembers those who dared to reach beyond the possible. Hannibal reached, and though he fell short, he touched eternity. The story of Hannibal is more than just a tale of battles. It is a story of ambition meeting destiny. His march across the Alps was not only a military maneuver, but a symbol of human determination against impossible odds. Soldiers trudged through ice and snow. Elephants trumpeted in misery. And yet Hannibal pressed forward. That moment captured imaginations for centuries because it spoke to something timeless. The will to push boundaries. Even Rome, though victorious, could not erase the memory of that daring journey. It remained carved into the annals of history, an eternal reminder of courage and madness, intertwined. Rome's survival reshaped its political culture. Fear of Hannibal created a mindset of expansion as security. The Senate argued that to prevent another Hannibal, Rome must dominate every rival before they rose too strong. It was not enough to defend their borders. They had to control the Mediterranean. The Republic turned to empire building, not out of greed alone, but from paranoia. Hannibal had unintentionally transformed Rome into something more dangerous by nearly destroying them. He gave them the justification to conquer others. The empire that would one day rule the known world was, in part, forged in Hannibal's shadow. Carthage's decline continued in slow motion. Once the jewel of North Africa, its harbors buzzing with trade, Carthage now lived under Rome's leash. It was still wealthy, still vibrant, but powerless. Citizens remembered Hannibal as their brightest flame, but also their greatest loss. They asked themselves if Carthage had wasted its destiny by failing to support him. For them, Hannibal became both pride and pain, a reminder of what they could have been, and of what they lost forever. His name was carved into their hearts, not just as a hero, but as a haunting. Generals who came after studied Hannibal obsessively. His tactics at Cannae became legendary, a model for perfection in warfare. Commanders across centuries dreamed of replicating that double envelopment, the move that annihilated a larger Roman army. Few ever managed it with the same precision, yet the fact that they tried speaks volumes. Hannibal's brilliance transcended his era. Even those who defeated him learned from him. He showed the world that brains could conquer brawn, that strategy could topple numbers, and that genius. Benin defeat Lee's lessons stronger than victory itself. The memory of Hannibal became myth in Roman culture. Parents frightened children with the phrase Hannibal ad portas, Hannibal is at the gates. It was a warning not just of danger but of discipline. To Roman citizens, Hannibal became both a nightmare and a standard of resilience. He was the reason Rome toughened its legions, the reason senators tightened their politics, the reason the Republic grew sharper. Hannibal had been their enemy, but he had also been their teacher. Rome was Rome because Hannibal forced it to become something greater than it ever planned to be. For Rome's allies, the war left mixed feelings. Some had abandoned Rome during Hannibal's campaign, thinking he would win, only to regret it when the Republic recovered. Others had stayed loyal, enduring suffering but rewarded with Rome's gratitude. The war tested the loyalty of Italy itself, showing who stood with Rome when the world seemed to crumble. Hannibal had tried to fracture that alliance, but in the long run, Rome's ability to hold it together was one of the keys to victory. The Republic survived, not just because of legions, but because its network of allies did not completely collapse. Hannibal's story also raises a timeless question. Can brilliance overcome fate? He was a man of unmatched skill, a commander whose every move seemed inspired, yet even he could not overcome limited resources, hesitant politicians, and the sheer willpower of an enemy determined never to yield. His downfall reminds us that genius alone does not decide history. Circumstances, luck, and the collective strength of nations shape outcomes as much as individual brilliance. Hannibal stood at the edge of history, reached for immortality, and touched it, but fate pulled him back. His brilliance was not enough to bend the world completely. The Roman people, despite their hatred, developed a grudging admiration for Hannibal. He became a measuring stick of greatness. Whenever a Roman general achieved victory, senators asked, was it as clever as Hannibal? Was it as decisive as Cannae? In this way, Hannibal lived on in the very culture that sought to destroy him. He became part of their identity, a paradoxical figure, both cursed and celebrated. Rome could not speak of its greatness without also recalling the man who had nearly undone it. In defeating Hannibal, they had defined themselves. Hannibal's influence stretched beyond war into philosophy. Ancient writers debated his choices, asking whether his gamble was wise or reckless. Some admired his daring, others criticized his inability to finish Rome after Cannae. The debate itself became part of his legend. He was not just a general, but a subject of endless fascination, a man whose decisions shaped history. Philosophers used him as an example of ambition, historians as a model of genius, and storytellers as a figure of drama. Hannibal was not easily categorized, and that mystery kept his name alive. As centuries passed, Rome eventually fell, but Hannibal's name endured. Empires crumbled, kings rose and vanished, and yet students of history kept studying him. His gamble at Cannae still appears in classrooms. His march across the Alps still fascinates explorers, and his defiance still inspires leaders. Hannibal's story proves that even in failure, one can achieve immortality. Rome won the war, but Hannibal won eternity. His life is proof that history belongs not only to the victors, but to those who dared to challenge destiny itself. Hannibal's gamble made him unforgettable, a ghost whispering through time. The memory of Hannibal never faded from Roman strategy. Long after his death, commanders prepared as if he might rise again. They trained their legions not only to win battles, but to anticipate the unexpected. Hannibal had taught Rome that arrogance was fatal, and they embedded that lesson into their doctrine. Future Roman wars, from Greece to Gaul, bore traces of Hannibal's influence. Every time Rome outmaneuvered an enemy, Hannibal's ghost stood in the background, a silent reminder that genius must be matched with caution. He had become the invisible general Rome never stopped fighting. Hannibal's gamble also influenced Rome's politics. Senators used his name to stir fear, reminding citizens that vigilance was survival. Political careers rose on promises of preventing another Hannibal. Even centuries later, when Rome had no true rival left, leaders invoked his ghost to justify new wars. He had become a convenient symbol, the eternal enemy at the gates. In this way, Hannibal shaped Roman ambition more deeply in death than in life. His gamble had failed militarily, but politically, it ensured Rome lived in perpetual motion, never satisfied, always seeking to crush the next threat before it grew. For historians, Hannibal became a puzzle. Was he a tragic hero who dared too much, or a reckless gambler who squandered his chance? Some argue that his failure was inevitable. Rome's resources were simply too vast. Others insist that with proper support from Carthage, he might have changed the world. The debate keeps his story alive, fueling books, lectures, and documentaries. Hannibal fascinates because he embodies both brilliance and imperfection. He reminds us that history is not black and white, but shaped by fragile choices. His story remains fresh because it never offers simple answers. Carthage's role in Hannibal's failure is often overlooked. The city had brilliance in its grasp, but failed to wield it. Political division, fear of risk, and jealousy of Hannibal's fame prevented decisive action. Carthage had the resources to reinforce him, yet they hesitated, hoping victories alone would be enough. By the time they realized their mistake, Rome had adapted. Carthage lost not because Hannibal lacked brilliance, but because the city lacked resolve. Hannibal's gamble shines as genius, but Carthage's hesitation doomed it. Their caution became the silent weapon that ensured Rome's survival. The ordinary people of Carthage carried Hannibal's legacy differently. To them, he was not just a general, but the embodiment of defiance. They whispered his name with pride, even when forbidden. His march into Italy became legend, a tale of Carthaginian courage that stood tall against Rome's arrogance. For a conquered people, Hannibal became more than history. He was identity. Even as Rome dictated their future, they clung to his memory as proof they had once shaken the world. He gave them dignity when politics stripped them of power. Hannibal was their eternal flame, flickering in defeat. Rome, in contrast, remembered Hannibal as both wound and warning. Veterans retold stories of Terra at Trebia, the Forge at Trasimene, the slaughter at Cannae. These tales became cultural touchstones, reminders of Roman resilience. Hannibal's shadow pushed Rome to expand faster, to dominate more completely, to leave no rival unchecked. The irony is clear. The man who nearly destroyed Rome gave it the motivation to conquer the Mediterranean. Hannibal lost his war, but he shaped Rome's empire. He was their greatest enemy, and yet he became one of their greatest builders through the lessons he left behind. Hannibal's campaign also reshaped military thought globally. The concept of striking at an enemy's heart, bypassing conventional strongholds, and using psychological warfare became part of strategic thinking for centuries. Leaders in Asia, Europe, and beyond studied him. His stories spread across cultures, inspiring not just warriors, but philosophers and storytellers. Hannibal was no longer only Carthaginian. He became universal. His daring belonged to humanity's shared history. Every empire that rose after Rome carried a fragment of his legacy. Knowingly or not, Hannibal proved that a single individual could shift the direction of civilizations. In the modern world, Hannibal's legend survives in unexpected ways. His name appears in literature, art, and even films, symbolizing brilliance against impossible odds. Military academies still dissect Cannae, while motivational writers invoke his march across the Alps as a metaphor for perseverance. Hannibal has become more than history. He has become myth. Even those who know little of Carthage know his name, whispered across centuries. This transformation from man to myth proves his gamble succeeded in one way. It ensured immortality. Rome won the war, but Hannibal won memory. The tragedy of Hannibal's life lies in its contrast. He achieved victories that stunned the world, yet he could not achieve the one goal that mattered: Rome's destruction. His life reflects the fragile balance between genius and futility. Hannibal was not undone by enemies alone, but by circumstance, hesitation, and fate. That makes him more human, more relatable. His story endures because it mirrors our own struggles, the bold attempts, the near victories, the bitter defeats. Hannibal reminds us that greatness often walks alongside failure, and sometimes the two cannot be separated. Hannibal's gamble continues to inspire because it was audacious. He dared what no one else dared, challenging the world's most disciplined military machine and nearly succeeding. His failure does not diminish his greatness. It enhances Italiano. He showed that even empires can bleed, that brilliance can shake giants, and that legacy is not measured by final outcomes alone. Hannibal's life is a story of defiance, of reaching beyond limits, of daring to gamble with history itself. And though Rome endured, the world never forgot the man who almost brought it to its knees. Rome's rise after Hannibal was not just about territory, it was about psychology. The Republic had faced annihilation and survived, and that survival turned into arrogance. Senators convinced themselves Rome was destined for greatness, chosen by the gods to rule the world. Hannibal had pushed them to their limits, and by surviving him, they believed no enemy could ever truly break them again. This mindset fueled Rome's conquests for centuries. Ironically, the man who nearly destroyed them gave them the confidence to build an empire without limits. Carthage, however, carried scars that never healed. The people lived under Rome's shadow, their pride broken, their ambitions crushed. Farmers still worked their fields, merchants still traded goods, but their hearts carried bitterness. Every ship they built, every coin they minted, came with Rome's permission. For them, Hannibal was not just a memory, he was freedom itself. A reminder of when Carthage stood tall. The city survived physically, but spiritually it was shattered. Rome had won the war, but Carthage would forever live in the shadow of what could have been. The Punic Wars revealed the power of endurance in history. Hannibal showed the brilliance of striking first, but Rome showed the strength of refusing to fall. Victory came not from one genius or one battle, but from relentless resilience. Rome could lose armies, suffer disasters, and still rise again. That lesson shaped not only their empire but the world's understanding of power. Hannibal taught us that genius matters. Rome taught us that persistence conquers genius. Together, their clash became the ultimate case study in survival and ambition. In literature and art, Hannibal became a romanticized figure. Painters depicted him at the Alps, standing tall against icy winds. Writers described him as both hero and villain, a man cursed by fate. His life became a canvas for human imagination, filled with drama and tragedy. Even centuries later, artists returned to his story, fascinated by its scale and emotion. Few figures in history inspire both awe and sorrow as strongly as Hannibal. He became not just a general but a symbol of what it means to gamble everything and lose. The Alps themselves became part of Hannibal's legend. Travelers crossing the mountains whispered of the Carthaginian general who had led elephants across the icy path. The very landscape carried his memory, turning nature into history. Long after his death, the mountains stood as silent witnesses to his audacity. Hannibal had bent nature to his will, even if only temporarily. That feat alone ensured his name would echo in eternity. For many, his crossing of the Alps became more legendary than his battles, a triumph of sheer determination over the impossible. Rome's victory at Zama ensured its dominance of the Mediterranean, but it also marked the beginning of its transformation into an empire of conquest. With Carthage subdued, Rome no longer had to fear rivals, and that lack of fear turned into ambition. They marched into Greece, Asia Minor, and beyond, convinced that destiny was theirs. Hannibal had shaped Rome's identity in ways even he never intended. By nearly breaking them, he gave them the justification to dominate others. In this way, Hannibal's gamble forged not just Carthage's fall, but Rome's future. For modern leaders and strategists, Hannibal remains a case study in daring. Military academies still analyze Cannae as the pinnacle of battlefield maneuvering. Business leaders reference his march across the Alps as a metaphor for bold risk. Writers see him as a tragic hero, undone not by weakness, but by circumstance. Hannibal's story continues to inspire because it blends brilliance with failure, triumph with tragedy. He is proof that greatness can exist even in defeat. The world still studies him not because he won, but because he almost did. Carthage's final destruction in the Third Punic War was, in many ways, Hannibal's shadow striking again. Rome, terrified of another Hannibal rising, obliterated the city completely. They salted the earth, burned the walls, and erased its existence. Yet in doing so, they confirmed his power. A man long dead had so haunted Rome that they destroyed an entire civilization to silence his ghost. Hannibal had lost the war, but his presence lived on, shaping Rome's paranoia even a century after his death. Few men in history have cast such a long and fearful shadow. The story of Hannibal also carries a universal theme: the cost of ambition. He reached for something no one else dared, Rome's destruction, and nearly grasped it. But ambition without support, without unity, is fragile. Hannibal's tragedy was not that he lacked genius, but that he stood alone. His soldiers followed him, but his nation failed him. The lesson is timeless. No matter how brilliant the leader, without collective resolve, greatness can collapse. Hannibal reminds us that history is written not only by leaders, but by the courage or acetation of the people behind them. Even today, Hannibal's name evokes awe. He remains the archetype of the brilliant underdog, the strategist who dared to challenge giants. His story inspires because it shows that power is never absolute, that even the strongest can stumble. Rome endured, but Hannibal forced them to fight harder than ever before. His gamble changed the world, not by succeeding, but by reminding humanity that greatness lies not only in victory but in the courage to attempt the impossible. Hannibal's gamble did not topple Rome, but it gave history one of its most unforgettable legends.